the total carbon footprint of a product is mostly in what's inside of it, not actually in its packaging. So if you can reduce the total carbon emissions of shipping things around without any system change, this has actually been quite a success.
Welcome to another episode of The State of Sustainability. I'm your host, Saif Hameed. In this episode, we speak with Shannon Bouton, CEO of Delterra. Delterra works at the frontier of system change with a particular focus on waste, threading the needle through the life cycle of products from design to disposal and beyond. I've known Shannon a long time, and I'm excited to dig into a diverse range of topics around packaging, waste, plastic, and the end of life of our products. Shannon, thank you so much for joining us. Super excited to have you on the show.
My pleasure. It's really lovely to be here.
So where do we find you today, Shannon?
I am in snowy Michigan. We actually have a little bit of snow in southeastern Michigan today.
Oh, nice. Well, I hope it's a warm and toasty sort of indoors winter in Michigan for you.
Yes, we have a nice fireplace, so it keeps us warm in the winter, or a wood-burning stove, I should say.
I'm super jealous. Well, super excited to have you with us to talk about waste, right, Shannon? This is a topic which you and I have sparred on for a few years off and on. And I am coming at it from one angle, and I think you're coming at it from a slightly different angle, and that's what makes this interesting. And so for our listeners, I'm just going to summarize what I see as the two vantage points here. Which is, for me, on the altruistic side, we deal much more in the emissions space and the climate space than we do in the waste space. Waste is starting to get interesting for us as well, but we typically view waste through the prism of emissions contributions and so on. Obviously, prior to altruistic, I've worked on waste in different contexts. And from your side, as I understand it, but I'd love to dig in deeper, Shannon, on the Delterra front, you're looking at systems change to stop waste becoming an environmental hazard altogether. I obviously know of your work in an emerging markets context. I know this started in Southeast Asia. I've been seeing some amazing work you guys are doing in LATAM as well. And so I think for you, it's much more about waste, the environmental problem itself, and the climate side is almost like a byproduct of that. Would you say that that's a fair summary, or would you put it differently? I'd love to hear the two-minute version of Delterra's work so far as well.
Well, so to your first question about whether I would separate the two, waste and climate change, there's a huge impact of waste on climate change, right? So, for example, methane emissions have been responsible for about 30% of the increase in global temperatures to date, including wastewater, but landfills as well are responsible for nearly 20% of global emissions of methane. But that's largely from organics. It's, that is the challenge there. It's hard to extract these environmental issues from one another. And I would say that we believe you're right, we are working towards system change. We're working towards reducing environmental impact, increasing circularity. But again, you can't separate all of these different things from each other, all these things that get lumped under environmental or, sustainability, because the planet is an interconnected organism, essentially, and then you end up oversimplifying.
I fully agree. I mean, one of the things that I always disliked about ESG metrics and kind of ratings and rankings is they try and equate different problems that might be completely different and actually not really be comparable in the same way. And I think actually it would be tempting to try and create a hierarchy of issues, but I think that's going to be difficult to do from an environmental perspective. What I would say is it seems to me that from a corporate perspective, waste actually makes its way usually to one of the top few initiatives that our customers tend to focus on in the food space, because it's quite closely correlated often with cost. It's quite visible to consumers as well. It's quite easy to control often. But I know in some other industries, waste actually never makes it onto the radar at all. I mean, do you think that waste is actually having a bit of a comeback over the last several years, or waste is coming to the fore?
Yeah, I like that phrasing of it, come back. But it in many ways, I think, is just becoming more and more visible in the environment. And so it's creating a more consumer concern, but also company concern. So we see a lot of companies that are deeply concerned about their personal impact on the environment. And companies are made up of human beings. And so there are a lot of people out there who really care about what their packaging that their company is selling, where it's ending up and how it's being used, or whether there's a second life to it and what its total environmental footprint is.
One of the things I've noticed, Shannon, particularly in the US, is that waste seems to sidestep a lot of the, I would say, like the ESG backlash that we're seeing on some other issues, like on EPR schemes, for instance. It seems that EPR schemes are treated mostly as a municipal topic or just something to do with city government and proper administration, rather than something that's politically charged across the left or right end of the spectrum. That's what it looks like a little from the European side. Would you say that's true?
Thank goodness. Yes. I think there's been a conscious effort to keep the packaging and plastics conversation separate from the climate action conversation, just because of how politicized it's become in the United States. So yes, I think that's absolutely true.
And within the waste spectrum, I've often wondered about the hierarchy of waste types. And I've found this to be a really interesting topic because, at least, when you and I were working on the ocean plastic stuff years ago at McKinsey together, one of the things that I came in with was this idea that plastic bottles are part of the enemy, and it's all these plastic bottles winding up on the beaches and so on. And actually, what I found through working in the space was that often PET is in the waste stream one of the good guys. Like, PET is easy to pick up, easy to sell, easy to monetize, easy to recycle. I sort of think of soda bottles as pretty good, and I think of shampoo sachets as the spawn of Satan, and like lollipop wrappers and all those sort of little crispy
little
things.
Tiny.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Little tiny crinkly things. Am I right, or would you classify it differently?
Well, look, I mean, one of the things I love about this space is how intellectually nuanced so much of it is, right? Yes, the little tiny pieces of packaging are the most leaky of the materials. You see them in the environment the most. They are incredibly hard to recycle, and often because they're made up of multiple layers of different materials, which makes them, almost impossible in many cases to recycle. But plastic overall, in general, right, if you look at it, it has lightweighted so many different systems, from automotive to clothing to whatever it is, right, consumer goods products and single-use materials. And that has actually led to reduced carbon emissions, right? So when you transport, let's say soda bottles in PET versus glass, you have more longevity of your product, you have lighter product, and it's less likely to break, so you lose less. And actually the total carbon footprint of a product is mostly in what's inside of it, not actually in its packaging. So if you can reduce the total carbon emissions of shipping things around, assuming that we are continuing to ship things around without any system change, this has actually been quite a success, right? So it is, from a market need, a market demand, plastic overall is a huge success. But you're right that sachets are very hard to collect, very hard to recycle, and they end up being very non-economic to recycle. So what you end up with is those are the things that get dumped in the street or burned, informally. And PET, which has a value, is then recollected and reused more often than other plastics.
I want to come back to a few of these points, Shannon, but first I want to pick up on one of the words that you used, which is leaky. And what you mean is waste leaking out of the system, right? I mean, what are the different ways in which, how do we think of a waste system as a well-running system that actually has no leakage? What does that look like? And what does a leaky system look like in this context?
So a well-run system would be one that doesn't allow waste to leak into the environment, and then actually figures out how to manage each stream of waste. And that's one of the reasons why waste is such a complex challenge, right? So every stream of waste has a different destination, a different way of being processed, and making sure that those are economic and that the material stays separated, maintains its highest value. That is a good system, right? Where you're figuring out how to collect in different streams, keep that material clean and separated, and then figure out the best possible destination, highest best use for it at the end of the system. A leaky system is going to be one where that material doesn't all get collected, which is about 60% of waste in the world today, right? About 2.3 billion people don't have waste collection. So many of them are left to either dump it into canals and rivers or burn it in their backyard, which is quite common, and so that's where a lot of waste ends up. That's a definite leak into the environment. And then even when you collect waste, and even if you aggregate it and try and manage it, often it's not being managed in a way that's appropriate, right? So there's a difference between a landfill and a dump, right? So many times dumps or even landfills that are not being managed correctly, material can flow right back out into the environment from that collection site. You see, wind picks it up and blows it out there. So there are lots of ways for waste to get into the environment. And so the goal of waste collection is to make sure that that is not happening.
Are there any rules of thumb that we can go with? I mean, for instance, do we find that actually certain types of waste will typically make it into riverways and oceans and certain types won't? I mean, we touched a little on the sachets and the thin films and so on. Is it basically, is plastic actually always the bad guy in this equation? Is it really a plastic waste problem and plastic packaging problem? Or do we need to worry about the other packaging materials? Do we need to worry about organic stuff as well? It can often be hazardous. Like, what are the big ticket items that you're focused on?
So I would say in systems where you don't have collection, everything ends up in the environment. And you're looking at different types of impact on the environment from different waste streams. So for example, from organics, you're going to see leachate, land and water contamination from that type of material as the material biodegrades. And that causes major issues, right? You've got aquifers that are contaminated by dumps and landfills and all sorts of challenges there. So, and then of course you've got the methane emissions that come from organic waste. So organic waste is by no means an easy thing to deal with, right? Plastic is the most visible, right? It's the longest lived in the system. It has a tendency to float. So if you get it into waterways, it's sitting on the top of it instead of sinking to the bottom. So you do have major issues with that. I think overall what we have to think about also is the economic value of these materials, right? So bottles do end up in the environment less often in places where they have value. They only have value where the transportation cost to the nearest recycler is not too high to offset the cost of, in the environment of these things, or the cost of transportation to that recycler. And you had mentioned earlier EPR. That's what EPR is trying to solve for. It's not so much of an environmental thing. It's much more of let's figure out how to balance the business case for different materials that are harder to recycle, the less economic to recycle, so that you can actually get some of these things to actually make sense economically to build back into a circular system. So you do see that water bottles are that way. But there's a main reason. One is, of course, PET is very recyclable, right? It's easily recycled. It's actually easily cleaned so that you can put it back into food grade, even if it wasn't, to get the chemicals and other things, contaminants out of it. But you also are looking at a bigger piece of plastic. So when you have a waste picker who is out there trying to collect kilos of material, they're going to want to collect those bottles because if they throw 10 bottles into their basket, it's the same thing as throwing, thousands of small pieces of sachet into their basket. So to get to the weight that they need in order to make a living, they're going to choose the bigger pieces of packaging. So traditionally we have seen, for example, paper is easily collected and often collected. Scrap metal has been collected for these reasons for decades, right? So plastic is a relatively new material, and what we see is, these are entrepreneurs. They're out there doing the best that they can with the small amount of time that they have to collect, and they will collect the heavier things.
This podcast is brought to you by Altruistic. Sustainability teams have one thing in common. They all have messy data sitting in silos across the business. This means 60% or more of their time is spent getting data into shape and not making sense of that data or using it to drive action. Altruistic's AI-based tools can help. Meet Evie, your in-house, always-on-call sustainability assistant. Evie works alongside you and your teams to clean up and transform your enterprise data into usable emissions calculations. Even better, Evie helps you interrogate this data, working like the junior analyst you wish you had. AI alone won't solve all your problems, but data transformation is one you can cross off your list. Visit altruistic.com to find out more. That's altruistic with a Q. I'd love to come back to EPRs as well, Shan, but before I do, when I kind of think about the different components to solve for this problem, and by solve for it, I mean minimize waste leakage out of the system, I think about what could we do on the producer side. So how can we get producers to produce the right kinds of packaging, to package things in the right sorts of packaging, to design for sustainability? And then I think at the other end of the spectrum, there's system design to ensure that things don't leak out, but also that end-of-life product gets sent back to the right destination so that it can facilitate a more reusable or recyclable system. Is there one of these that is more important, or is there one of these that is easier to get going? I mean, you're probably working on both sides of this. Like, which of these do you find the harder nut to crack versus the bigger nut to crack?
I think it's always going to be easier to design for the system, right? And that is going to be critical. So for example, sachets, there are already many companies that are working on designing sachets out of the system, making them simpler so that they're one material only, so that they are recyclable, thinking about collection systems for them, moving away from them, like paperization is a solution in some cases. So at least if it does leak into the environment, it doesn't stick. It's a bit of a confusing space, but there's also the compostability conversation, where they're creating compostable plastic. So those things, if we can make it possible for not to have to change the system, right? It's always going to be easier not to change the system because, changing the way that people behave, the way that they consume is always going to be a harder lift. And then also, encouraging communities and countries to leapfrog some of the mistakes that have been made in the global north over the years is really tough too. We talk about, for example, burning waste to energy can be perceived as a silver bullet for many of these countries because it looks like the waste just disappears. But of course, we know that that's not. It's not as simple as that, right? So you do get benefits from waste to energy if you are able to produce energy from it, and you maybe can recover some of the metals from it and get some value that way. But we do have seen historically that countries have a tendency to overbuild this infrastructure and then lock themselves into long-term public-private commitments where, for example, they have to keep producing waste in order to produce that electricity, and then they are committed to buying off that electricity at a certain price. So it's and then it counteracts the recycling, right? So it's in every case in system, it's always about making sure that you are. I tell my team this all the time, thinking about things as making sure that you're not coming up with solutions that are individually correct and collectively wrong, because you're constantly looking at not trying to build a system that you have to then break out of again later.
At the same time, though, I want to go a little deeper onto this waste to energy question because I do think there's an argument to be said for how waste to energy can solve the problem at scale quite cheaply. And if so, I remember when I was last working on this topic and we were looking at China as a big contributor to ocean plastic. And actually one of the initiatives on the horizon was a massive program to set up incineration capacity. And I remember thinking that if this incineration capacity had proper controls to prevent emissions leaking out into the system, that actually looks pretty elegant. Throw in things like gasification, maybe a bit of pyrolysis, and actually you get a pretty nice spectrum of dealing with the waste. Obviously, you have very limited capacity to split things out of that system. So it's basically just going to, in fact, the more you split plastics out, the less energy you get out of those systems often, because plastic is one of the higher calorific value components. Is it just I'm locked into that system once I get started? Like, why would I not want that kind of a system, especially in the global south?
Okay, well, so yes, you're right. There are a number of countries that have gone wholesale in that direction, including countries in the Middle East and China. And then we saw, of course, Sweden is the case example of that having happened, starting in the 70s, and Denmark's in that same situation. It's not as simple as you burn it and it's gone, right? So you are left with toxic ash that you have to then figure out what to do with. And Singapore is a perfect example of that, right? They've got an entire island that is a pile of toxic ash. And, you're sort of trading one problem in terms of contamination for another, and you're condensing everything down into a smaller space, more condensed, right? Concentrated. So it's not an easy thing to just say waste energy. But then the other challenge is you can't burn all of your waste, right? There's only a fraction of it that can be burned. So it's not as simple as just collect all the waste and stick it into a waste energy plant. It has to be pre-processed, often to remove water, often depending on how much organics you have to maybe remove a lot of the organics. It has to have an exact calorific value when it goes into that waste to energy system. And so, like you said, you do end up burning things that might be recyclable, but you also have to sort of manipulate your feedstock going into that system. And then, as I mentioned previously, you do run into challenges where you've seen historically that countries lock themselves into a sort of perverse incentive to generate more waste in order to feed these systems. So you're going to want to make sure that you take all the current knowledge and make sure you're right sizing what the infrastructure that you're building, so that you're not overbuilding and then committing to the point where you then have to import waste in order to make the whole system work. You do see countries make that conscious decision. So they may be sitting amongst a bunch of countries. We see this in the Middle East, where some countries have decided that they're going to overbuild because they're going to import waste from their neighbors to solve for some of those challenges too. But, that has to be done very consciously. We know a huge amount now since Sweden started really building out this technology. And so we need to be taking all of that into account when we think about it.
And China famously closed its doors to importing Europe's waste, right? Some years ago, actually. So that strategy does backfire.
Well, so they weren't importing it to burn. They were importing it to recycle, right? And so what they were finding was, there wasn't a huge incentive for countries like the United States to actually sort their waste well. And in fact, they could get rid of some of it. So they were sending it to China, and it was highly contaminated. And so they would open up a bale of PET and find a whole bunch of, let's say, diapers in the middle of it, right? And then you're in a country that isn't necessarily set up to manage that waste as well as the United States was. So you're sort of handing your challenge off to another country that has to deal with it economically, but also environmentally. What China did was actually, it's not that they completely closed their doors. They set a standard of how much contamination they would accept. And when, U.S. and European MRF, material recovery facilities, couldn't manage that level of contamination, then they got rejected.
Interesting. That part of the story often gets dropped, no? There is actually that the waste didn't meet the bar.
Yeah. And you can't really blame China for having done what they did, right?
No.
And then, of course, the bad actors out there started sending their waste to Malaysia or to Indonesia or wherever else would take it, right? And then those countries started rebelling. So the challenge is we have to manage our waste locally. It's really important. And it's not a good idea to be shipping waste all over the world, right? It's not a good use of our resources.
No, it's surprising that could make economic sense, right, either.
Well, I think it was that big shipping containers were coming across into the U.S. from China, and then they were going back to China empty, right? So they were putting waste in them as they were sending them. But yes.
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
This feels like the right time for a short break. We'll be back right after this message from our sponsor. Moving on to the material design side, we've talked a little bit about system design. My sort of basic principles here are that you want to reduce, reuse, and recycle somewhat in that order when you talk about how am I kind of, let's say, on the brand or on the producer side, optimizing for waste minimization. Is that the right rule of thumb here? Like I want to kind of lightweight, try and minimize the amount of packaging or material that I'm using. Realize we're talking a lot about packaging, but let's come back to that. And then my second route is, okay, actually, the more that I can switch to a reuse model, the better. If I can get bottles back and refill them rather than making a whole new bottle, that's better. And then if I can't, then actually using more recycled content. Are these three sort of pillars the right pillars, and did I list them in the right order?
Yes. I mean, so we absolutely want to reduce and reuse before we start thinking about recycling. From the days that you and I worked on things like energy efficiency, that's the same thing, right? You insulate your house before you try putting in renewable energy, right? So you want to make sure that hierarchy is there, that you're reducing the amount of material that's going into the system. But, we can't, not one of those is going to solve the problem. We have to use all the tools in the toolbox. And that's why it's important that we get all of them right. I would also add a couple extra R's. There's a redesign R that is being thrown around a lot now, and a rethink R, which is not just reduce, but do you really need this product? And if we do need it, in what form do we need it? So I think there are lots of ways to think about that system. Recycling should be the last effort probably that you deal with that material. I do want to come back to that lightweighting thing though, because it's kind of a weird, difficult one, right? If you lightweight everything, when you start thinking about the recycling part of it, you change the business case on those things. So you see a lot of, for example, PET bottles getting lightweighted. You can, you get water bottles that are the really thin, cheap
A thimble,
ones,
basically, yeah, a thimble full of plastic.
Yeah. And in developing economies or in emerging economies, you will see those being left behind because they don't have enough weight to them. So that there's this weird perverse incentive that is created by reducing the amount of plastic in the environment, but maybe creating a worse business case, which means that they don't actually end up getting recycled, whereas they might have otherwise.
Well, one of the things I find, Shannon, is that people think of recycling and recyclability as the same thing, but actually they're quite different. I mean, what you're describing with the outcome of lightweighting is a recyclability problem. Similarly, actually, if I kind of layer on different plastics onto each other, if I take, let's say, a soda bottle, right? I mean, there's a big difference between whether you actually have the film sort of grafted on, so it's very hard to remove, or whether you have the film where it sort of slips off quite easily. One is much easier to recycle at the end of the day than the other, and that's independent of how much recycled content I used coming in. Do you find that these two topics are being taken equally seriously in industry, which is how much recycled content am I using, but also how do I optimize this product for someone else to recycle later down the road?
Yeah, I think there is definitely a growing recognition of that. And those companies that are converters, those are the ones that turn the raw material into packaging, are spending a great deal of time doing R&D on, what is the material. So, for example, there used to be a major problem in some cases, some brands, there still is, where they were putting PVC around PET bottles. There you have to remove the label before you can recycle because PVC contaminates PET recycling and you can't separate them in the recycling system. But those companies are actively working on redesigning and changing that, right? And there's a lot of thought about what is the label that I'm putting on my bottle, or what type of material is it? And companies are transitioning to more recyclable materials. There are even situations where, for example, companies are making conscious decisions to remove the color from their materials and just use clear, because then everything can be reused in the same system. You don't have to separate it out because you can't get the dyes out of plastic afterwards. But you're right that the demand side of this, like who is going to reuse that material afterwards, is a critical challenge. And this is one of the things that a lot of the big companies that are involved in this space are clamoring for, is minimum recycled content regulation, because unless you create that, you can't create the pull for that material. And it's all a market balance, right? So if there's no demand for it, no one's going to buy it. No one's going to bother to recycle it. So we talk about technical recyclability. There's a lot of material that is technically recyclable, but there's no business case for it, so it doesn't get recycled. And a perfect example, to take us back to the organics, is we've been working a lot with organizations like the Global Methane Hub to figure out what is the business case for the products from organics. Because if you can compost it, you're aerobically digesting it instead of anaerobically digesting it in a landfill. You don't get a lot of the bad side effects and you're processing it properly. But selling compost is a tough market, because getting post-municipal waste to the quality that you would want to use it in some of the biggest sinks like agriculture is really hard, right? There's a lot of contamination in municipal waste. So you have to constantly be thinking about what is the product that you're going to create afterwards. And this is actually our very first project in the United States that we're looking at, is which products that are currently not using recycled material but could be using recycled material could we encourage to now experiment with. We're going to be running pilots to test the use of post-municipal plastics in some of these products, largely construction and ag films and stuff like that, and then try and figure out, how can you increase those sinks for that recycled material.
Are there initiatives that you're really excited about? Like, are there any either new technologies or products that you think have real potential at scale?
Yes. So that's a tough question because there's a lot of polemic stuff going on in the recycling space, right? So we as Delterra are sort of agnostic at the moment about things like chemical recycling and dissolution and stuff like that, because we don't operate in places where those are available, and it's not commercially really viable at this point in time. But that could be a game changer if we can get it right and we can get the environmental balance right. And they call it advanced recycling to try and move it away from the chemical recycling label. But, it all comes down to the same thing. You're taking the material and trying to figure out how to use the molecules again. So I'm not sure I would say I was excited about it, but I'm tentatively optimistic and watching what's happening. Back to the organics, there's a lot of use of something called black soldier fly to actually process the material, which actually turns it into larvae of insects. So the insects eat this material. Because they're insects, they can even eat the meat because the prion diseases don't transfer, like mad cow disease doesn't go through an insect. So that then produces a high protein powder that can be used in animal feed and fish feed and stuff like that, So that's a really interesting potential. It's not a technology as such, it's using biology for it, right? It's really hard to get it right at scale. We've been struggling with that in Indonesia, but in Europe they're doing it in huge warehouses and it's working well. So there are some of those things, but there's never going to be a silver bullet. Even chemical recycling is, trash in, trash out. So you're only going to get the quality out that you put in. So you still have to sort your waste. You still have to manage and figure out how to reduce contamination and all of that. And collection, right? You have to get the material back into the system.
Always one of the hardest parts. Shannon, we're approaching the end, but I wanted to ask, our audience is composed of sustainability professionals working typically in large consumer goods companies and consumer goods value chain. If you had to give them one piece of advice, and the things that they'll care about is how do I meet my goals and my targets for my corporate strategy to minimize waste? How do I get consumers on board? How do I play into consumer narratives when it comes to how my company uses packaging or deals with waste? Like, what advice would you give them? Are there things that you've seen work? Are there things you think they should look at? Topics you think are interesting?
So there's not one silver bullet on that question, but I do think that simplification is the key, right? So we all have held a piece of packaging in our hand and tried to figure out, is this recyclable? The simpler you can make it for the consumer, the more appreciative they will be and the more recycling we will get. So as you're designing your packaging, I think often the departments that design packaging are part of the marketing group, and they're often not thinking about the sustainability. They're worried about colors and what's going to appeal to consumers, etc. But again, trying to figure out how to disaggregate material to be recycled, whether it's a box or a bottle or whatever it is, making sure that everything you're doing is simple and communicates well to the consumer how to recycle so that you're empowering them to be able to recycle. Sometimes you're going to run into problems where there is an additional cost. But I actually would say that's the responsibility of businesses in doing business these days, is to think about making sure that the packaging that they are putting into the environment for consumption is as recyclable as possible, but also as sort of understandable by the consumer as possible.
Maybe, Shannon, just before we do close off, when we talk about business value, obviously I think that most businesses are appreciating that there is a cost element. Are there areas of business value that you also are noticing? I mean, there's probably something around reducing packaging costs. Are there others that you think are interesting?
So I think there are companies that are starting to differentiate themselves based on their packaging. For example, Apple has moved towards trying to make as much of their packaging paper as possible. One of the things that I remember just being in awe of Lisa Jackson, who's their sustainability director, was to get that sustainable paper into the system, they would have to drain everything that was currently available. So they actually went out and bought forests and then managed them correctly in order to produce their own paper so that their effort was additive into the system. Those are amazing efforts that they're making. And I hope honestly that their consumers are appreciative of it. But they should be doing that type of thing, right? Because they're selling, luxury items, honestly.
Product,
yeah, a premium product.
Well, Shannon, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this. Really appreciate you joining us, and so much to digest here.
Yeah. You're very welcome. It's been lovely to chat with you.
Thanks for listening to this edition of the State of Sustainability podcast. Follow the podcast so you never miss an episode. And if you like the show, please leave us a review or a rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. There's more info on the show notes, and we'll be back in a couple of weeks.